The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of the Mitchell Ranch, turning what had once been fertile grazing land into a wasteland of dust and withered grass. Tom Mitchell wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed his dying cattle, their ribs showing through dull coats as they gathered around the nearly empty water trough. The summer of 1887 had been the harshest anyone in Dry Creek could remember, and Tom's small ranch was feeling every scorching day of it. "Pa, the Henderson bull died during the night," called out his 16-year-old son, Jake, his voice carrying the weight of bad news that had become all too common. The boy's clothes hung loose on his frame. They'd all been eating less to save money, hoping the drought would break soon. Tom's jaw tightened as he calculated the loss in his head. That was the third head of cattle this month, and with beef prices already low due to the widespread drought affecting ranchers across Texas, he couldn't afford many more losses. His wife Martha appeared on the porch of their modest wooden house, shading her eyes with her hand as she looked out at her husband and son. "Tom, Mr. Carruthers from the bank is here to see you," she called out, her voice carefully neutral, but Tom could hear the worry underneath. The banker's visit was expected, but no less unwelcome. James Carruthers sat uncomfortably on the Mitchell family's worn sofa, his city clothes and soft hands a stark contrast to the rough frontier home. He clutched his leather satchel nervously as Tom entered, hat in hand but shoulders squared with the pride that had kept the Mitchell family going through 20 years of frontier life. "Tom, I'll get straight to the point," Carruthers began, avoiding eye contact. "The bank can't extend your loan any further. The drought's hit everyone hard, and we've got our own pressures from back east. You've got until the end of August to bring your payments current, or—" He let the sentence hang in the air. "Or you'll take the ranch," Tom finished quietly. "James, my family's been working this land since before there was a town here. My father died defending this place from Comanche raids. You're talking about 20 years of sweat and blood." Carruthers shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, Tom, truly I do. But business is business. Maybe you could sell to the Morrison outfit. They've been buying up struggling ranches, consolidating them into bigger operations." Tom's hands clenched into fists. The Morrison Ranch was owned by wealthy investors from back east who treated the land like numbers on a ledger, not like the living, breathing home it was to families like the Mitchells. "I'll find a way to pay," Tom said firmly. "This drought can't last forever." After the banker left, Tom stood on his porch looking out at the dying land that had sustained his family for 2 decades. The creek that gave the town its name had been reduced to a muddy trickle, and even the town's main well was running dangerously low. Neighbors who had been friendly competitors were now eyeing each other's water sources with desperate calculation. That evening, as Martha served a dinner of beans and cornbread, luxuries like meat had become too expensive, she reached across the table and took her husband's weathered hand. "Tom, maybe we should consider Mr. Morrison's offer. Jake could get schooling back east, make something of himself that doesn't depend on the whims of weather and cattle prices." Tom looked at his son, who was trying to appear older than his 16 years, ready to support whatever decision his father made. "This land is who we are, Martha. My father used to say that a man's roots run as deep as the wells he digs. If we give up now, what does that teach Jake about facing hardship?" Late that night, Tom walked out to the old abandoned well at the far corner of his property. His grandfather had dug it by hand in the 1840s, but it had been sealed up for decades after the family had moved their operations closer to the creek. Now in the pale moonlight, Tom wondered if the old-timers had known something about water sources that his generation had forgotten. The land held secrets, and maybe it was time to start digging them up. It was the next morning, brought no relief from the relentless heat, and Tom found himself drawn back to the old well. He brought along his father's journal, yellowed pages filled with the careful handwriting of a man who had learned to read late in life. As he sat in the shade of the lone oak tree that stood sentinel beside the abandoned well, Tom searched for any mention of why his grandfather had chosen this particular spot to dig. "June 15th, 1848, he read aloud to himself. "Pa says the Comanche told him water runs deep here, following underground rivers that never dry. The old chief, before the trouble started, showed him how to read the signs, the way certain plants grow, how the ground feels underfoot during the dry season." Tom looked around with new eyes. Even in the midst of the drought, he noticed that the grass here was slightly greener than elsewhere, and a few hardy wildflowers still bloomed near the well's stone rim. His grandfather hadn't just been guessing when he'd chosen this spot. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Sarah Coleman, the town's school teacher, and one of the few unmarried women in Dry Creek, rode up on her mare. At 28, Sarah had the independence and education that came from growing up in Austin before coming to the frontier, but she'd chosen to stay in Dry Creek even when more prosperous opportunities called her back to civilization. "Morning, Tom," she called out, dismounting with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. "I heard about Mr. Carruthers' visit yesterday. News travels fast in a town this size." Tom stood, instinctively removing his hat in the presence of a lady. "Sarah, I suppose the whole town knows our business by now." "The whole town's in the same boat, Tom. The Henderson family is talking about packing up and heading to California. The Kowalski farm hasn't had a decent crop in 2 seasons. We're all just trying to hold on until the rains come." She approached the old well and ran her hand along the stone rim. "I remember your father telling stories about this well, said it never ran dry, even during the drought of '63. "You think there's truth to those stories?" Tom asked, studying Sarah's face. She had a practical mind that balanced perfectly with her optimistic nature, qualities that made her an excellent teacher and trusted confidant to many in the community. "I think your grandfather was a smart man who understood this land better than we give him credit for." She peered down into the dark shaft. "The question is, how deep would you have to dig to find water? And do you have the time and money to find out?" That afternoon, Tom rode into Dry Creek's main street, a dusty thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings that had seen better days. The general store, saloon, church, and handful of other businesses that comprised the town's commercial district all showed signs of the hard times that had settled over the community like the ever-present dust. He found Pete Kowalski at the blacksmith shop, where the Polish immigrant was repairing farm tools with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most respected craftsmen in the county. Pete looked up from his anvil, his weathered face creased with concern. "Tom Mitchell, I heard about your troubles with the bank. Same story everywhere. The drought's got us all by the throat." Pete set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "My Anna, she's talking about taking the children back to her sister in Galveston. Says there's no future in farming dust." "Pete, I need to ask you something," Tom said, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "You've been here almost as long as my family. Do you remember anything about the old well on our property? My grandfather's well?" Pete's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, yes. My father, when he first came here in '52, he worked for your grandfather for a season. He used to talk about that well. Said it had the sweetest water in the county, even when everything else dried up. But your father sealed it when they moved operations closer to the creek. Why would he seal a good well? Practical reasons, I think. Too far from the house and barn. But my father always said it was a mistake." Pete leaned against his workbench, his expression growing thoughtful. "You know, Tom, in the old country, we had sayings about water. 'The deepest wells sing the sweetest songs,' my grandmother used to say. Maybe it's time to listen to the old songs again." As Tom prepared to leave, Pete called out to him. "Tom, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you'll need help. A man can't dig a well alone, especially not in ground that's been baked hard by this heat. If you decide to try, you let me know. Times like these, neighbors need to stick together." That evening, Tom shared his conversations with Martha and Jake over their modest supper. Martha listened with the practical concern of a woman who had learned to manage a household on the frontier, while Jake's eyes grew bright with the enthusiasm of youth facing an adventure. "It's a gamble, Tom," Martha said finally. "We barely have money for food, let alone paying men to dig a well that might be dry." "But what if it's not?" Jake interjected. "Pa, if that well has good water, it could save not just our ranch but help the whole town. Think about what that would mean." Tom looked at his son, seeing in the boy's earnest face the same determination that had driven the Mitchell family to build a life in this harsh but beautiful land. "It's not just about the water, son. It's about refusing to give up on something that's worth fighting for." Dawn came with the same relentless heat, but Tom Mitchell felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in months. Word of his plan to reopen the old well had spread through Dry Creek overnight, and by sunrise he found Pete Kowalski and 2 other neighbors, Bill Henderson and young Miguel Santos, waiting by the abandoned well with shovels and pickaxes. "Figured you could use some help," Pete said simply, rolling up his sleeves. "Bill here's got nothing but time since his cattle started dying, and Miguel's between jobs at the Morrison place." Miguel, barely 20, but built like a man who'd spent his life working the land, nodded respectfully. "Mi abuelo, He worked wells in Mexico before coming north. He taught me some things about reading water signs. This spot, it feels right. Tom felt a lump in his throat at the show of solidarity. In times of plenty, neighbors competed. In times of crisis, they became family. I can't pay you boys much. Who said anything about pay? Bill Henderson interrupted, his gruff voice softened by genuine affection. Tom, your family helped build this community. Time we returned the favor. The work was backbreaking. The old well needed to be cleared of debris that had accumulated over 2 decades, rocks, dead animals, and layers of sediment that had turned to concrete under the Texas heat. The first day yielded only a few feet of progress, but Tom noticed that the deeper they dug, the cooler the air became, and the earthen walls showed traces of moisture. Sarah Coleman arrived at midday with a wagon full of water jugs and sandwiches prepared by the ladies of the church auxiliary. Figured you men would work yourselves into the ground without someone making sure you stayed fed and hydrated, she said with a smile that made Tom's heart skip despite his exhaustion. As the men rested in the shade, Sarah examined the walls of the well with the curiosity that made her such an effective teacher. Tom, look at this, she called out, pointing to a section where the earth showed distinct layers of different colored soil. My father was a surveyor before he became a rancher. He taught me that these layers tell the story of water, how it moved through the ground over years and decades. Dr. William Hayes, the town's physician and one of its most educated residents, arrived in the late afternoon. A man in his 50s who had given up a comfortable practice in Dallas to serve the frontier community, he brought both medical supplies and geological knowledge gleaned from his university education. Gentlemen, I've been hearing about your project all day, Dr. Hayes said, examining the progress with professional interest. I took the liberty of consulting some geological surveys of this area. According to territorial records, this region sits above what geologists call an artesian aquifer, underground water that flows between layers of rock. If your grandfather was right about the location, you might find water under enough pressure to rise on its own. That evening, word of the well project had reached every corner of Dry Creek. Tom found himself hosting an impromptu town meeting in his front yard, as neighbors gathered to discuss what the discovery of a reliable water source might mean for the community's survival. Mayor Jonathan Whitfield, a portly man who had made his fortune in the cattle business before turning to politics, cleared his throat importantly. Now, Tom, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we need to think practically. If this well produces water, how do we ensure fair distribution? We can't have people fighting over access. One problem at a time, Jonathan, replied Reverend Samuel Porter, whose small church served as the community's moral center. The Lord helps those who help themselves, and Tom's showing more faith than I've seen in this town all summer. I say we support him and trust that Providence will provide a solution. Martha stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had learned to speak her mind in a male-dominated world. If this well produces water, it won't belong just to the Mitchell family. This land has been part of Dry Creek since before any of us were born. Whatever water we find, we'll share it fairly with anyone who needs it. Tom looked at his wife with renewed admiration. In that moment, he understood that Martha hadn't just been supporting his decision to dig. She had been thinking several steps ahead, seeing the bigger picture that would bind their community together through the crisis. James Carruthers, the banker, had remained silent during most of the discussion, but now he spoke up hesitantly. Tom, I want you to know that the bank, well, we're willing to extend your deadline if this well project shows promise. The success of individual ranchers affects the whole community's economic stability. By the end of the first week, the well had been cleared to a depth of 30 feet, and the signs were encouraging. The earth was becoming increasingly moist, and Miguel's experienced eye detected the subtle changes in soil composition that suggested they were nearing water. More importantly, the project had galvanized the entire community in a way that surprised everyone involved. Each morning brought new volunteers. Mrs. Henderson organized a rotation of women to provide meals and water for the workers. The Kowalski children appointed themselves official messengers, riding between the well site and town to carry updates. Even some of the Morrison ranch hands, despite their employers' disapproval, showed up during their off hours to lend a hand. Your grandfather knew what he was doing, Dr. Hayes observed on the 8th day, examining core samples of earth brought up from the depths. This soil shows clear evidence of underground water flow. The limestone layers here are perfect for filtering and storing groundwater. Tom wiped the sweat from his face and looked down into the increasingly deep shaft. They had constructed a simple pulley system to haul up buckets of earth and rock, and Miguel had shown them how to brace the walls with timber to prevent collapse. The work was dangerous. One wrong move could trap a man underground, but the sense of shared purpose kept everyone focused and careful. Sarah had become an unofficial chronicler of the project, documenting their progress with the same attention to detail she brought to teaching. She interviewed the older residents of Dry Creek, collecting stories about the early days when water sources were a matter of life and death for the struggling settlement. "Tom, I've been talking to Mrs. Garcia, whose husband worked for your grandfather," Sarah reported during the noon break. "She remembers that the well originally went down about 50 feet before they hit what her husband called the singing water, an underground stream that flowed year-round." "Singing water?" Jake asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. Miguel laughed. "Mi abuelo called it the same thing. When you hit flowing water underground, it makes a sound, like music in the earth. You'll know it when you hear it." On the 10th day, at a depth of 45 feet, they heard it. A subtle change in the echo when they dropped stones into the shaft, a resonance that suggested space and movement below. Miguel lowered himself into the well on a rope, his voice echoing up from the depths. "Agua! I can see water pooling at the bottom," he called out. "It's seeping in from the walls, but slowly. We need to go deeper to reach the main flow." The excitement was infectious, but Tom forced himself to remain cautious. "How much deeper, Miguel?" "Maybe 5, 10 feet more. The water is there, but we need to break through to where it flows freely." The final push took 2 more days of careful work. They had to remove water as they dug deeper, using buckets in a continuous relay that tested everyone's endurance. But on the afternoon of the 12th day, Miguel's excited shout echoed up from the depths. "El agua canta! The water sings!" Within minutes, clear, cold water began rising in the shaft. By evening, it had reached a level 15 feet from the surface, more water than anyone had dared hope for. Tom lowered a bucket on a rope and brought up the first sample. The water was crystal clear and sweet, without the mineral taste that had plagued the town's other sources. Dr. Hayes tested the water with the primitive but effective methods available on the frontier. "It's clean, Tom. Better than clean. It's some of the purest water I've seen in this part of Texas." As word spread through Dry Creek, the entire population seemed to converge on the Mitchell Ranch. Families brought their children to see the miracle well. Ranchers who had been considering abandoning their spreads began talking about staying through the drought. The general store owner started calculating how much business a reliable water source might bring to the town, but it was Reverend Porter who captured the moment's significance when he offered an impromptu blessing over the well. "Lord, we thank you for reminding us that even in the driest seasons, your provision flows beneath our feet. Help us remember that what we've found here belongs not to any one family but to all who call this place home." Tom stood with his arm around Martha, watching their neighbors celebrate around the well that had seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. Jake was already talking about building a proper pump system, while Sarah was discussing plans for a community water distribution schedule that would ensure fair access for everyone. "You did it, Tom," Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our home." Tom looked out at the faces of his friends and neighbors, illuminated by lantern light as they gathered around the well that would sustain their community through the drought and beyond. "No, Martha, we did it, all of us together." 3 months after the well was completed, Dry Creek had transformed from a dying frontier town into a beacon of hope that drew visitors from across Texas. The autumn rains had finally come, but by then the community had learned that their survival didn't depend solely on the whims of weather. They had discovered something more valuable than water. They had rediscovered the strength that came from standing together. Tom Mitchell stood beside the well on a crisp October morning, watching as Miguel Santos operated the hand pump they had installed with money raised by the entire community. A steady stream of crystal-clear water flowed into the wooden trough that now served families from as far as 20 miles away. What had started as one man's desperate attempt to save his ranch had become the foundation of the region's revival. "Mr. Mitchell," called out a voice behind him. Tom turned to see a well-dressed gentleman approaching with a leather portfolio under his arm. "I'm Charles Brennan from the Texas Agricultural Development Company. I've been hearing remarkable stories about what you folks have accomplished here. Tom shook the man's hand warily. Experience had taught him to be suspicious of strangers bearing official titles and promising easy solutions. "What can I do for you, Mr. Brennan?" "We're prepared to offer your community a substantial sum for the rights to this water source. Our company specializes in developing water resources for commercial agriculture. We could transform this entire region into productive farmland." Before Tom could respond, Sarah Coleman approached with a group of school children who were on their daily nature study walk, a new addition to the curriculum that emphasized understanding the land that sustained them. The children gathered around the well with the reverence that came from understanding its importance to their family's survival. "Mr. Brennan," Tom said carefully, "I appreciate your interest, but this well belongs to the community. It's not mine to sell." The businessman's smile faltered slightly. "Surely you understand the economic potential here. Our agricultural specialists could increase land values tenfold. Everyone would benefit from the prosperity we could bring to this region." Sarah stepped forward, her teacher's instinct for protecting what mattered most clearly engaged. "Mr. Brennan, prosperity means different things to different people. To us it means families being able to stay on land their ancestors died to defend. It means children growing up in a community that values cooperation over competition." Dr. Hayes emerged from the small clinic he had established next to the well, where he treated not only the residents of Dry Creek, but travelers who stopped to water their horses and rest in the shade of the cottonwood trees that had been planted around the site. "Gentlemen, if I may add a medical perspective, this community's health, both physical and social, has improved dramatically since the well project brought everyone together. That's not something you can measure in dollars." That afternoon, the town held its monthly community meeting in the church, which had been enlarged thanks to donations from grateful families whose lives had been saved by access to reliable water. Mayor Whitfield called for order as the wooden pews filled with ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, and their families. "Friends, we need to discuss Mr. Brennan's offer," Whitfield began. "It's a substantial amount of money, enough to make everyone in this room comfortable for the rest of their lives." Bill Henderson stood up, his weathered hands gripping the back of the pew in front of him. "Jonathan, 3 months ago I was ready to abandon my ranch and head to California with my tail between my legs. Now my cattle are healthy, my pastures are recovering, and my grandchildren are learning to read in Sarah's schoolhouse. You can't put a price on that." Pete Kowalski rose next, his Polish accent thick with emotion. "In the old country, my family lost everything because we trusted outsiders who promised prosperity. Here, we built something with our own hands, together. That is worth more than any company's money." Martha Mitchell stood, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had helped hold the community together through the hardest times. "This well saved our ranch, that's true, but more than that, it saved our community. It reminded us who we are and what we can accomplish when we work together. That's not something we can sell to the highest bidder." Reverend Porter concluded the discussion with characteristic wisdom. "Friends, we've learned that the deepest wells aren't just about water. They're about the roots we put down in a place and the bonds we forge with our neighbors. Some things are too precious to have a price." The vote was unanimous. Dry Creek would maintain community control of the well and continue the cooperative system they had developed. As winter approached, Tom found himself busier than ever. The success of the well project had led to his election as head of the newly formed Dry Creek Water Cooperative, which managed not only the distribution of water, but also the maintenance of the irrigation system they had constructed to help local ranchers and farmers. On a clear December morning, he stood with Sarah at the edge of his property, looking out over green pastures where his cattle grazed contentedly. The creek that had given the town its name was running full again, fed by autumn rains and careful management of water resources throughout the valley. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't decided to dig?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the crisp air. Tom considered the question seriously. "I think someone else would have found a way. When people are desperate enough, they find strength they didn't know they had. But I'm grateful it worked out the way it did." Sarah smiled, the expression that had brightened many of Tom's days over the past months. "The children in my class are writing compositions about the well project. They understand that what happened here wasn't really about water. It was about refusing to give up on something worth fighting for." That evening, the Mitchell family gathered around their dinner table, which now featured not just adequate food, but the luxury of fresh vegetables from Martha's garden, irrigated with water from their community well. Jake, who had grown taller and more confident through his participation in the project, was full of plans for the future. "Pa, I've been thinking about what I want to study when I go to college," he said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I want to learn about engineering and geology, about how to find water and build systems that help communities like ours." Tom looked at his son with pride that went beyond words. The boy had learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach, that individual success meant nothing without the foundation of community strength. "That sounds like a fine plan, son, but remember, the most important thing about finding water isn't the technical knowledge. It's understanding that some wells run deeper than others, and the deepest ones are always shared." Later that night, Tom walked out to the well for his evening inspection. The pump handle was still warm from the day's use, and the sound of flowing water created a peaceful counterpoint to the cricket chorus that filled the night air. In the distance, he could see lights in the windows of homes that might have been abandoned, if not for the decision to dig a little deeper when everything seemed hopeless. Martha joined him, slipping her hand into his as they stood beside the well that had become the heart of their community's renewal. "Tom, do you remember what your father used to say about a man's roots running as deep as the wells he digs?" "I remember. I think maybe it works the other way too," she said softly. "Maybe the wells we dig are only as deep as the roots we've already put down, in the land, in each other, in the belief that some things are worth whatever it takes to preserve them." Tom pulled his wife closer as they listened to the gentle sound of water flowing through the pipes that carried life to their neighbors' homes. Above them, the Texas stars shone with the clarity that only comes in the cleanest air, and the wind carried the scent of rain that promised another good season ahead. The well at the Mitchell Ranch would flow for generations, becoming part of the legend that bound the community of Dry Creek together. But those who lived through its discovery would always know that the real miracle hadn't been finding water in the desert. It had been finding each other when they needed it most, and learning that the deepest wells are always the ones we dig together.